Hi, I'm Cindy Cloud with Riley Blake Designs, and today I'm going to be talking to you about basic quilting vocabulary. If you're new to quilting, there's probably a lot of terms that are not familiar to you, so I'm going to talk about quilting terms from A to Z, and they're not meant to be all-inclusive, but they're going to give you enough of the lay of the land to get you started in quilting. So let's get started with our first term, which is appliqué. What is appliqué? Appliqué is the method in which you attach smaller pieces of fabric to larger pieces of fabric in a pattern, like a geometric or an image, like this flower. I love appliqué. And there's 3 ways to appliqué your pieces onto your base cloth. One is machine appliqué, one is fusible interfacing, and the third, which is my favorite, is hand appliqué, hand sewing it on. So that is appliqué. The next quilting term we're going to talk about is backing. You have a quilt top, and then you have batting, and then backing. Backing usually comes in 44 to 45 inch width fabric, and you can easily put it on the back of your quilt. So here's backing on the back of a mini quilt, but some quilts are really large, and what's really nice that's on the market is wide backs. Now wide backs come on the bolt. This is a wide back. You can see how it's a little bit larger bolt, and it's 108 inch wide. So for your large quilt tops, it's perfect to back your quilts in a wide back. So that is backing. The next thing to talk about is batting. Batting is what is sandwiched between your quilt top and your backing, is batting. And I'm not going to go into all the different kinds of batting that are available, but know that there's everything from cotton to polyester. So look into batting, what you like best for your quilts. The next thing we're going to talk about is binding. Once you have your quilt top, your batting, and your backing, and it's all quilted, it's time to add your binding. It's the final touch on a quilt. My mini quilt here has the binding all the way around, and I'm not going to get into the details on binding. We have great tutorials on our website about how to bind a quilt. Okay, next up is block. It is the basic foundation of your quilt, and so whether it's itty bitty, small, or medium, or even a large quilt block, you need quilt blocks to assemble your quilt. So how you do that is sometimes you just sew all your blocks together, and then sometimes you use borders, sashing, and posts. So in this quilt, I'll show you, this one has an outside border. So this little mini quilt, that's an outside border. This larger quilt, we have an outside border. It kind of frames the quilt blocks in the middle, but you can also further frame your quilt blocks with sashing. You can see this nice applique block in the center, and you've got your sashing here. Usually sew your 2 sashing pieces, and then you have posts in all 4 corners, and you sew this top and bottom section on. So that is borders, sashing, and posts. I'm going to move that to the side. And the next thing we're going to talk about is chain piecing. Chain piecing is an effective way to quilt or sew together your blocks. And you get your blocks together. It's kind of an assembly line process. And it's the method in which you sew together your block units without lifting your presser foot or cutting your threads. So it's a great thing to learn when you're beginning to quilt and you don't waste a lot of thread in the meantime. So that is chain piecing. Now, let's talk about the quilter's clapper. Now we have a couple sizes. This is the smaller size. We have a tailor's clapper that's a little longer. It's a classic sewing tool, and it's made out of hardwood. Ours is made in the United States. And how you use it is it's used with a steam iron to set your seams. But it also works really effectively if you've just got a super hot iron to lay down on your seams. It gives you really crisp seams. So I love that tool, the clapper. The next thing is let's talk about cutting tools. Now, when cutting out your all your bits and pieces, there's no better way than a rotary cutter. So you need a nice sharp rotary cutter. This is one of my favorites, and with a rotary cutter you need a self-healing mat. So here's a mat, and then of course you need your rulers to cut out your various pieces. Now when you're appliquing, you need some good scissors. I always like some small scissors, large scissors to cut out your applique pieces. And there's just a lot of rulers or cutting tools that you can find out for yourself what works best for you when you're quilting. So that is cutting tools. The next thing we're going to talk about is fat quarters. It's one of the pre-cuts that's very common in quilting, and it is 1/4 of a yard, a piece of fabric, which finished cut size approximately 18 by 22. It looks like this. And fat quarters oftentimes are found in fat quarter bundles. Again, a great pre-cut. A lot of patterns call for a fat quarter bundle, and you can see a beautiful collection, how it all works together, and you're all ready to start your quilt. Easy as that to choose fabric from a fat quarter bundle. So let's talk about finger press. So a finger press, it is the method of pressing a seam with your finger and pressure. A lot of times you iron your seams, but sometimes you just quickly and easily can finger press too if you're working on small blocks that a finger press will do. So I've just finger pressed that unit right there. That works pretty good on some of your piecing sections. Okay, flying geese. So flying geese is a common quilt block. This block is made with a rectangle. So here you see it's made with a rectangle and 2 squares. And you start with putting one side on, sewing across, and you get that unit like that. You trim that off, and you add your second block on like that, sew across, trim it off the back, and you've got your flying geese. Very common quilt block. Half square triangles. Now that is also a very common quilt block, and it's a good term to know. So here's my half square triangle, just like it sounds, and you make that by putting 2 pieces together, sewing across. Sometimes you make 2 at a time, so you can mark in the center and sew on each side to make 2 units, but I've just made 1 with this, and that's what a half square triangle looks like. Let's go to our next term, which is machine piecing, and it's simply that, using your domestic machine to sew your pieces together to make a quilt block. And sometimes we call that quilting, but officially quilting your quilt is sewing all your layers together. And you can still do that on a domestic machine like I've done here. That's been sewn all together, all the layers. Or there's what's called a long arm quilter, and it's someone who has a large machine, industrial machine, that can sew all those layers together and make beautiful patterns on your quilt. That's one of my favorite ways, is to take my finished quilt top to a long arm quilter for them to finish that process for me. So next term is marking tools. One of my favorites is just a mechanical pencil. And when you're marking a quilt block, you simply usually have to have, a ruler, and then you can mark it with your mechanical pencil. You can use these friction pens, which they disappear once you apply heat to it. So when you iron or when you press your quilt block, this disappears. There's also erasable markers that rinse out when you wash them. And you can also mark. This is a marking tool and a turning tool. You can mark it without making any kind of visible mark, but it creates a crease, and that is your mark. So those are various kinds of marking tools that you'll need in quilting. The next term is called nesting your seams, nestling your seams, or just simply nest your seams. You hear that a lot in quilting, and it's where you've pressed your seams in opposite directions, and then you line them up together like this, so you can see that, and it almost feels like it clicks into place. And you can even just fill it. And a lot of times when you're sewing that together, you can just put a pin right there and your seams are nested together, and that quilt block's ready to go and to be sewn. So that term is nesting. So these are 9 patches in a 9 patch. So you can see we've done a little teeny 9 patch, even though it's different size, but you can see the overall quilt unit is a large 9 patch sewn together. So that is 9 patch. Okay, pressing, a really important part of quilting. So I brought my little iron from the mini sewing set. It's not really available in the general market. I found this vintage iron online. And I brought a little mini clapper. Again, we just made this little mini clapper for our sewing set. But I'm going to show you how you press your blocks. Now, pressing is different than ironing. Ironing, you move the iron around, but you're putting a lot of heat on certain areas of your quilt block, and it's generally on your seams. Now, you can use steam, which for some quilt blocks is just what you need, and the clapper's really good at, after you've steamed your seams, to take out the heat and moisture, so when you remove your clapper, you have very crisp seams. But some items you don't want the shrinkage with the steam and the heat, so you just press. And you just not move around. You press one area, lift the iron, move it around. You don't want to distort your fabric at all. And I oftentimes follow up with my clapper. Again, pressing is an important part of quilting. You do one section at a time, and if you press as you go along, you'll have better quilt blocks. So that is pressing. So let's go to the next thing. Quilting term is quilting cottons. Basically, when you're talking about quilting cottons, it means high quality fabric that has a nice tight weave, and they use color fast dyes, meaning heirloom quality, because you're making an heirloom project that you want to stand the test of time. So use high quality quilting cotton fabric. And Riley Blake Designs makes some of the best on the market. So that is quilting cottons. Let's talk about quilt sandwich. This is an example of a quilt sandwich. It's a little mini quilt, and you've got your quilt top, your batting, and your backing. And it's all ready to be quilted either by a machine or a long arm quilter or hand quilted. And that is what a quilt sandwich is. Okay, let's talk about raw edge. I've got a long piece of fabric. We got our selvage on this side, and this is our raw edge. It's the cut side of your fabric, or it's the raw edge of your quilt block. So that is raw edge. Let's talk about right sides together. You often see it in patterns, RST, and it's where you use, there's definitely a wrong side and a right side of a fabric, and you see the bright pattern on this side and the dull fabric on that side. We're putting our two pieces right side together. That's what you do in quilting and even sewing clothing. RST, right sides together. And the wrong side of your fabric faces outside. The next term is called seam allowance. Here is an example of a seam allowance. Officially, it's called the distance between the fabric edge. So here's your raw edge and the seam line, which is right here. The most common seam allowance in quilting is a 1/4 inch. So if you're quilting, just assume it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance unless you're told differently. And that is your seam allowance line. Next thing to talk about is selvage. Here we've got our raw edge. Here's the selvage edge. And the selvage edge gives you a lot of information. It tells you who the manufacturer is, the fabric collection, usually the designer of the fabric collection, but it also tells you what colors are used in the fabric. So next time you're in the quilt store, fabric store, look at the selvage, because it does give you a lot of information. The next term we're going to talk about is squaring up your block. It's important to precision cut and precision sew, but we know we're not perfect. And so then we need to square up our blocks to get the right measurement that the pattern is requiring. So, for example, Here's a sewn quilt block, half square triangle. I have a square up ruler, which is meant to just square up your block, and I can put it right there on the sew line and center it. If it was an applique project, I would center it in the center of this. And this is a trim up ruler, and I would trim all around 4 sides to give you the correct size block. So that is squaring up your block. You can do that with machine piecing or applique blocks. Okay, unit. Unit is basically sewing 2-pieced blocks together to create a unit. So if I sewed these together, this would be 1 unit. And a lot of times patterns will talk about sections or units. The last term we're going to talk about is width of fabric. You often see it in a pattern, WOF. And what that means is the fabric from selvage to selvage. You've got your raw edge on top, selvage to selvage. Since it's a cotton natural fiber, it varies from about, I've seen 43.5 to 44 inches wide. But generally it's between 44 and 45 wide. So those are some basic quilting terms. To get you started in quilting, we have a series called Building Blocks. So come sew with us and learn how to quilt block by block.